Hello, welcome to our presentation on the range of gear switching alternatives that the Council adopted for consideration at its September 2021 meeting. There are two presentations for you to look at. The first one, this, provides an overview of the alternatives, and the second gets into areas in which there are a few complexities that need to be resolved before we can move to full analysis. This issue originally came up in the first Council review of the trawl catch share program, toward the end of which the Council adopted a control date, notifying anyone that planned to start gear switching that their ability to continue might be limited by new policies. In the spring of 2018, the Council convened the Sablefish Management and Trawl Allocation Committee, which began development of the alternatives, starting with over 20 and narrowing them down to 3 in their final report in June of 2020. Between November 2020 and April 2021, the Council took a step back to consider overall levels of gear switching and decided to use a 29% maximum amount of gear switching as the basis for further development of the alternatives. It adopted a range of alternatives at its September 2021 meeting and is scheduled to return to this issue at its June 2022 meeting. The Council action for its June 2022 meeting will be to receive an update on the alternatives and address issues as needed to allow a complete analysis. Most of part one of this presentation will be an overview of the alternatives. Then I'll provide a few cross-alternative comparisons. And finally, as a prelude to the next presentation, end with a preliminary discussion about why these alternatives are more complex than groundfish limited entry type alternatives the Council has developed in the past. Before getting into the alternatives, I want to provide a bit of context for anyone not completely familiar with the issue. The context will be important for interpreting the issue and alternatives. The scope of this action is the Groundfish Trawl IFQ program, which covers shoreside trawl landings. Because the program started in 2011, references to gear switching prior to this time also means after January 1st, 2011. To participate in the trawl program, a trawl limited entry permit is required for the vessel. Therefore, all references to permits are references to these trawl limited entry permits. The scope of the action alternatives will be limited to Sablefish North. So, for example, all references to quota shares and quota pounds are references to Sablefish North quota shares and pounds. A few terms. For anyone not familiar, gear switching means the use of non-trawl gear to harvest trawl quota as part of the trawl IFQ program. In the IFQ alternatives, when we talk about current, we're talking about the point at which allocations are being made as part of an action alternative. So this would be a point in the future if one of the action alternatives is selected and implemented. Turning now to the alternatives, as always we have the no action alternative under which gear switching would continue unlimited in regulation but limited by markets and so forth. Then there are the two action alternatives, each of which in one way or another restricts northern sablefish gear switching. Those action alternatives are based on holding gear switching to no more than 29%. The 29% was derived from the average share of gear switching as a percentage of the utilized trawl allocation from 2011 to 2016, all of the full calendar years of fishing that occurred prior to the control date in 2017. As I mentioned earlier, the Council adopted this maximum policy at its April 2021 meeting. In relation to the no action alternative, I want to take a moment to review the key provisions of the catch share program that relate to the gear switching issue and design of the action alternatives. The opportunity to gear switch is created by the fact that a trawl permit is required to participate in the IFQ fishery, but vessels with trawl permits can use any gear to fish against the trawl quota. The regulations were amended in 2017 to allow a fixed gear and trawl permit to be registered on the same vessel at the same time, which made it easier for fixed gear vessels to fish both IFQ and the limited entry fixed gear tier fishery. The remainder of the provisions I'm going to highlight are important to keep in mind as we work through the provisions of the action alternatives and their impacts. First, recall that any person, including non-fishermen, can open a quota share account and acquire a quota share. But a quota share account itself is not transferable. Then each year, the annual quota pound is issued to quota share accounts, and it must then be transferred to a vessel account in order to be used. And finally, that for northern sablefish, there is a vessel quota pound use limit of 4.5% and a quota share control limit of 3%. Another aspect of the catch share program that impacts the design of the current alternatives is the Adaptive Management Program, or AMP. At the start of the catch share program, 90% of the quota share was allocated to limited entry permit owners, leaving 10% unused and available for the AMP. The AMP was intended to be used to provide incentives or other compensation to offset adverse impacts of the program. However, to date, a specific use has not been identified, and the AMP quota pound has been passed through to the quota share owners in proportion to the shares they own. As a result, for example, each year someone owning 1% of the quota share receives slightly more than 1.1% of the quota pounds. Now we'll turn to the action alternatives. The two action alternatives each use a different mechanism to limit gear switching, and that mechanism is reflected in the short title of the alternatives. Alternative 1 is gear-specific quota share. All northern sablefish quota share would be designated as either trawl only or any gear. Any gear quota share function is essentially the same as status quo quota share in that it could be used for gear switching. Alternative 2 would not alter the northern sablefish quota share, but would establish gear switching endorsed permits with annual gear switching limits individualized to each permit based on gear switching history. So for Alternative 1, in order to gear switch, a person would need a limited entry permit and some of the any gear quota pound issued to holders of any gear quota share. Quota share owners with a gear switching history would have most all of their quota share designated as any gear quota share. Others would have only some or none of their quota share designated as any gear quota share, and the rest converted to trawl only. To qualify for gear switching history consideration, an entity would have to both own quota share on the control date and have a history of owning a vessel they use to gear switch. Only the quota share amount they own on the control date might potentially be designated as any gear quota share. Moving to Alternative 2, gear switching would continue to simply require a vessel registered to a trawl permit, but there would only be a very small annual gear switching limit for permits that did not carry a gear switching endorsement. The gear switching limits would be substantially higher for permits with gear switching endorsements. The endorsements would be issued based on a gear switching history and attached to the limited entry permits. That qualifying history would involve currently owning a limited entry permit and/or a vessel that had gear switched, and possibly having owned quota share. Now let's take a closer look at the alternatives, starting with Alternative 1. Once implemented, Alternative 1 would work relatively simply. All northern sablefish quota share will have been designated as either trawl only or any gear quota share, and the quota pound issued for each type of quota share would have a similar designation. It would be treated the same as quota share for any other IFQ species management unit, except that information on the gear used to catch the fish would then be added to the quota tracking system to ensure that the proper type of sablefish quota was used to cover the catch, trawl only or any gear. There are options for the Council to select that specify the amount of each type of gear-specific quota share that would be created, but the maximum amount of any gear quota share under those options would be 29%. So now let's talk about the steps to get to implementation. As I mentioned, there would be a one-time conversion process in which all of the existing northern sablefish quota share would be designated as either any gear or trawl only, with any gear being like status quo. Then each year, the annually issued northern sablefish quota pounds would be issued as trawl only and any gear quota pound and given to the corresponding quota share owners. As long as the proportion of trawl only and any gear quota share matches the quota pound proportions by gear type, the amount of northern sablefish quota pound a quota share owner receives would not change, only the gear type designations. The process for achieving the quota share split would involve applying the gear designations to the quota share, what we are calling converting, even though for the any gear quota share the main change is only the addition of a label. The conversion process would have to be carried out for quota share owners and for the quota share reserved for the AMP. For the quota share owners, the processes would first involve classification of the current quota share owners and quota share. Entities that owned quota share as of the control date would be categorized into a participation status and the amount of quota share they owned on the control date identified. Then quota share held by those entities in excess of what they held on the control date and quota share held by new quota share owners would be identified. After the quota share owners are classified and quota share amounts identified, conversion formulas would be applied, and we'll go over those in a few slides. Then all of the quota share held in reserve for the AMP would be converted to any gear and trawl only quota share. And in the final step, all of the any gear quota share would be grouped together and all of the trawl only quota share grouped together and the amounts adjusted so that each type adds to 100% and each type can, from that point on, be treated like the quota share for any other species or species groups. The next two slides will cover the steps 1A and 1B of this process. Step 1A is to classify participants and identify amounts of quota share these entities owned as of the control date. The classification steps would be to first identify those entities that own quota share as of the control date and own a vessel and used it to gear switch prior to the control date. Any quota share owner that is not classified as a gear switching participant would be evaluated to determine if they are an IFQ participant. There are two options for IFQ participant status. Under the first option, it would simply be anyone that is not a gear switching participant. Under the second option, it would additionally require ownership of a vessel while it made a bottom trawl landing of sablefish. If the second option is selected, then anyone that did not qualify as a gear switching or IFQ participant would be classified as an other participant. And the other part of this step would be to determine the amount of quota share each of the classified entities owned as of the control date. Step 1B then is to look at the amount an entity held as of the time of implementation and determine whether any of that amount is in excess of the amounts held on the control date. The amount owned on the control date is a cap on what would be converted based on their participant status. So for example, here we have someone that held 1% of the quota share as of the control date, divested some during the interim period, but then by implementation date had bought some back. In this example, the amount they owned as of implementation would be 0.8%, and that amount would be converted based on their participant status. But they could have bought back up to 1%. However, anything they owned in excess of the amount they owned on the control date would not be converted based on their participant status. New quota share owners are essentially a special application of this rule to those that own quota share at the time of implementation, but did not own any quota share as of the control date. Basically, their conversion cap is 0. So, quota share owned in excess of the amount an entity owned on the control date and quota share owned by new quota share owners are essentially the same. That then covers steps 1A and 1B, classification of all current quota share owners into participant classes, and identification of amounts of quota share to be converted based on those statuses. Now we'll look at steps 2 and 3, making the conversions to gear-specific quota share. For conversion step 2, we'll use as an example the target of splitting the quota share into 29% any gear and 71% trawl-only quota share. Later, we'll be seeing that based on the quota pound split options provided in the alternative, there could be a different target ratio for the quota share split. Based on the outcome of steps 1A and 1B seen in the previous slides, we have on the left-hand side here the 3 categories of quota share owners and quota share. Those groups are gear switching participants, IFQ participants, and other participants plus the quota share in excess of what was held on the control date, which includes all new quota share owners. Quota share owners classified as gear switching participants would have 100% of their quota share converted to any gear quota share unless it was in excess of their control date holdings. And quota share owners classified as other participants and the quota share amounts held in excess of amounts held on the control date would all be converted to trawl-only quota share. That leaves the amounts to be converted for IFQ participants. These owners would have some of their quota share converted to any gear and some to trawl only. The proportions converted to each would be based on what is necessary to achieve the desired split between the any gear and trawl only quota share. Again, here we are using as an example the target split of 29% any gear and 71% trawl only. To achieve this, we would first look at the amount of any gear quota share converted for gear switching participants, then the amount converted for other participants. Then on the basis of what came out of those 2 calculations, determine the split of percentages for IFQ participants that would be needed to achieve the 2971 outcome. Conversion step 3 is pretty straightforward. The AMP quota share would be divided using whatever the target percentages are for the amount of quota share to be converted to each type. Here we are continuing the example based on the 2971 split. So that covers the first 3 steps, and now we'll look at the final step. In the final step, we make an adjustment so that the gear-specific quota share will add up to 100% like it does for the other IFQ species categories. So in step 2, we divided the quota share owner quota share, represented here by the dark bluish color, into any gear and trawl only using the 2971 split. And in step 3, we divided the AMP quota share, represented here by the shaded slice, into those same proportions. The end result is that the combined quota share owner and AMP quota share, that is any gear quota share, is 29% of the total quota share, which continues to be represented here in blue. And the combined quota share owner and AMP quota share, that is trawl only, is 71% of the total quota share, now represented here as purple. Next comes an adjustment step, in which all the any gear quota share is multiplied by a factor so that instead of 29%, it totals to 100%. And the same is done for the trawl only quota share. So that completes an explanation of the conversion process, and now we'll move to talking about the options for determining the annual quota pound splits that would then feed into the quota share splits. As I mentioned earlier, there are options for the different any gear trawl only quota share splits. The quota share splits are determined based on the desired split in the quota pounds that will be issued for each type of quota share. So let's look at those quota pound split options. The first option is just the straight 2971 split that we've used for our examples. The second option would be variable and be a maximum of 29%, but not more than 1.8 million pounds of any gear quota pound, with the remainder going to trawl only. The 1.8 million pounds is the maximum total pounds used for gear switching in any 1 year between 2011 and 2016. Under the quota pound split option 2, the percentages used for the one-time implementation of the quota share split would be determined by whatever the quota pound split would be in the year that the conversion is made. When we looked at this slide earlier, we noted that as long as the proportion of quota share designated as trawl only and any gear quota share remained the same as the proportions of trawl only and any gear quota pounds issued, that the holder of quota share would receive the same number of total Sablefish quota pounds after implementation as they did before. However, if there is a possibility that the proportions of each type of quota pounds issued would change in the future, as would potentially occur under quota pound allocation split option 2, where the any gear quota pound cap is set at 1.8 million pounds, then it's possible that in some year in the future the quota pound proportions would shift between these groups, and individuals would receive somewhat different amounts of quota pounds for their quota share than they would have in the absence of this action, with those holding trawl only quota share experiencing an increase and those holding any gear quota share experiencing a decrease. Since the 1.8 million pound cap would only be reached as allocations on the whole were increasing, the decrease that we're talking about would be relative to what would have happened in the absence of this action, not relative to the absolute amount of quota pounds they received prior to the time the 1.8 million pound cap was reached. For our last slide under Alternative 1, we just want to review the specific qualification options for each class of participants. Again, these classifications apply to quota share owners at the time of implementation. To be classified as a gear switching participant, for option 1, a quota share owner would also have to have owned a vessel and used that vessel to gear switch and land northern sablefish prior to the September 15, 2017 control date. For option 2, the owner would have to have owned a vessel and used it to land at least 30,000 pounds per year for 3 years prior to that date. To be classified as an IFQ participant, option 1 is simply that the quota share owner did not qualify as a gear switching participant. Option 2 requires that the quota share owner have owned a vessel that made at least one delivery of northern sablefish caught with bottom trawl in the 2 calendar years prior to the conversion. So it is only under option 2 that you would have some quota share owners not qualifying as either a gear switching or IFQ participant, and they would be classified as an other participant. Now we'll move into Alternative 2. Under Alternative 2, some permits will be endorsed for gear switching. Those would generally have larger annual northern sablefish gear switching limits than vessels fishing under permits that are not endorsed for gear switching. The limits for endorsed permits will be individualized to the gear switching history and possibly quota share holdings related to each recipient. Vessels fishing under permits not endorsed for gear switching will all receive the same gear switching limit, generally smaller than for the endorsed permits. The main provisions of the alternative cover implementation and address who receives an endorsement and what is the amount of the gear switching limit associated with the endorsement. With respect to endorsement implementation, there are two sets of qualifier options. One is centered around current ownership of a permit with a qualifying history, and the other around current ownership of a vessel with a qualifying history. Note that current means at the time the endorsements are issued as part of implementation. Similarly, with respect to the individualized gear switching limits, there are two sets based on permits and two sets based on vessels. These sets of options are not totally independent. For example, if a permit qualifier option is selected, then a permit-based limit option should also be selected. Looking at the first set of qualification options, there are three based on permits and three based on vessels. Each set of three has the same pattern of options. Option 1 would simply be currently owning a qualifying permit, or in the case of the second set of options, a qualifying vessel. Option 2 would include all of option 1, plus that some amount of quota share be owned as of September 15, 2017, the control date. Option 3 would include all of option 2, plus the ownership of the opposite of whatever was required under option 1, but on the control date, not at time of implementation. So, if under option 1 a qualifying permit was required as of implementation, then under option 3 the addition would be a requirement that a vessel be owned as of the control date. Additionally, for the vessel requirement, it has been specified that the vessel should have some history of gear switching. And if under option 1 a qualifying vessel was required as of implementation, then under option 3 the addition would be the requirement that a trawl permit be owned as of the control date. In contrast to the vessel, there is no specification that the permit has to have a history of gear switching. Next, we turn to determination of the limits that would be associated with the endorsements. As with the endorsement qualification options, there are two sets of three options for the limits. Each set of three is similar, but there are differences depending on whether the qualifier is the permit or the vessel. Option 1 would base the limit on the gear switching history of the qualifying permit or vessel, and it would be the average annual percent of the trawl allocation caught by gear switching in years fished up through the control date. Skipping to option 3, the limits would be the percentage of quota share owned as of and continually since the control date. Then option 2 is a combination of both. We would start with the percentages owned under option 3, then apply the values from option 1, but adjust those values downward as necessary to keep the sum of all the limits for the endorsed permits to a maximum of 29%. The 6 qualification and 6 endorsement limit options, I want to take a moment to review the option nomenclature that you will find in the description of the alternatives and related discussion. First, you'll notice that all the qualification option numbers start with Q and all the limit options start with L. Then that for the qualifier options based mainly on permits, the next letter is P, followed by option numbers 1 through 3. So the permit qualifier options are numbered QP1 through QP3. Then for the qualifiers based mainly on vessels, the second letter is V, and the same pattern is followed. As with the qualification options, for the limit options that correspond to the permit qualifier options, the second letter is P, followed by the option number designators. And those for the limit options that correspond to the vessel-based qualifier options, the second letter is V, followed by the option numbers. While I noted in the previous slide, the permit qualifier options need to be matched with permit-based limit options, the option numbers do not necessarily need to match. In other words, QP1 could be matched with any of the LP options 1 through 3, and the same applies with respect to vessel qualifier and vessel-based limit options. Turning to the non-endorsed permits, all vessels fishing with a non-endorsed permit would have the same standard limit of 10,000 pounds of northern sablefish gear switching. Now we'll move to provisions more related to the alternative after implementation. What happens when gear switching endorsed permits register to a different vessel mid-year? A permit could be moved among vessels so that the endorsement limit is split between vessels. Alternatively, a vessel could fish endorsed permits sequentially up to the 4.5% annual vessel quota pound limit. This is somewhat like what happens in the limited entry fixed gear stacking program. Except in the trawl program, a vessel cannot have more than one trawl permit registered to it at the same time. I would also note that for the vessels with non-endorsed permits, the gear switching limits would be vessel limits rather than permit limits. So a single limit could not be fished by multiple vessels. Next, what happens to endorsements when permits are combined to get a permit with a larger length endorsement? If only one of the permits is gear switching endorsed, then that endorsement survives. But if each permit has an endorsement, then only the larger of the two survive. This differs in comparison to what happens to gear endorsements, trawl, longline, or fish pot, when trawl permits are combined. In the case of a gear endorsement, both permits have to have the same gear endorsement, for example, 2 trawl endorsements, in order for the trawl endorsement to survive the combination. Next, what happens if there are overages? This is an issue because for the trawl fishery, catch rather than landings is counted against the limits. So there's no opportunity to get within a limit by discarding. It would be very difficult for a vessel to hit its limit right on. Either it would have to leave opportunity on the table or risk an overage. Under alternative 1, if there is an overage, the overage would have to be covered with any gear quota pounds before the vessel could go fishing again. Under alternative 2, the overage still has to be covered with quota pounds, but that does not address the issue of an overage of the gear switching limit. So there are 2 options. Either the vessel would simply be prohibited from gear switching on subsequent trips without any other consequence or penalty, or it would be prohibited from gear switching on subsequent trips and the overage would come off the following year limit for that permit. The final question is whether the gear switching endorsements continue indefinitely and transfer with the permit, or do they expire with the transfer to a different owner? And there are options to cover either of those policy approaches. Now we are going to look at some cross-alternative comparisons, starting with one for those receiving gear switching opportunities based on a connection to historic gear switching practices, and then a slide with comparisons for those entering in the future. Under Alternative 1, an entity that qualifies as a gear switching participant would have 100% of its quota share converted to any gear quota share. It would be able to acquire additional any gear quota share from other any gear quota share holders up to the quota share control limits. And if it had a vessel, it could acquire additional any gear quota pounds from others up to the annual vessel limit. Under Alternative 2, those allocated a gear switching endorsement to be placed on their permit would have a gear switching limit based on historic catch or quota share owned or some mix of those. there would be an opportunity for them to expand gear switching activity up to the 4.5% annual vessel limit through sequential registration of endorsed permits. Assuming that a gear switching limit is adopted and the policies in place well into the future, for much of the time, the impacts of the alternatives might relate more to their impacts on future participants rather than current participants. So under Alternative 1, new entrants could gear switch to the same level as legacy participants. They could do this by acquiring any gear quota share, and/or they can acquire any gear quota pounds in season up to the annual vessel limit. Under Alternative 2, new entrants could gear switch up to the 10,000 pound level for vessels fishing with non-gear switched endorsed permits, but if gear switching endorsements do not expire on permit transfer, they would also have an option of acquiring an endorsed permit and gear switching limit up to the same levels as initial recipients. However, if the gear switching endorsements are not transferable, then new entrants would be limited to the 10,000 pound annual limit that applies to vessels fishing under permits without endorsements. Another minor contrast between the alternatives is how the amount of quota share issued on the control date is used in the initial allocations. We looked at a slide like this for Alternative 1 and noted that the amount owned on the control date would serve as a cap on what could be converted based on an entity's participant classification. Between the control date and implementation, they could divest and reacquire quota share, and it would not change that cap. Under Alternative 2, if quota share is used to determine an endorsement limit, the cap would be the minimum amount owned between the control date and implementation, the amount owned as of and continuously since the control date. So if a quota share owner divests and reacquires, what they reacquire would not count towards their endorsement limit for the permit. Finally, I want to talk briefly about what makes these alternatives somewhat more complex than groundfish limited entry alternatives the Council has looked at in the past. It is these complexities that will be covered in the next presentation. In previously adopted groundfish limited entry programs, the Council is allocated based on who owned a qualifying asset at the time of implementation. For the license limitation program, it was who owned a vessel with qualifying history. And it was current ownership of a permit with qualifying history for the Sablefish endorsement, limited entry fixed gear Sablefish tiers, and trawl catch share program. So in all cases, the question of implementation was, what is the history of the vessel or permit, and who owned it when the program was implemented? For Alternative 1, we're looking at a combination of vessel ownership at the time of gear switch landings, quota share ownership as of the control date, possibly vessel ownership at time of bottom trawl landings, and quota share ownership at time of implementation. And for Alternative 2, depending on the option selected, we're looking at vessel or permit ownership as of implementation, and only that for Option 1 qualifiers, so that would be similar to the past. But for other qualifying options, there is consideration of quota share ownership as of the control date, quota share ownership as of and since the control date, and permit or vessel ownership as of the control date. The challenge the current alternatives bring up include addressing changes in the composition of ownership groups between the time of historic activity and the time of implementation. This will be the focus of the second presentation.